All right. Hey, everybody. So this is the second part of our look at Catholicism and modernity in the 19th and 20th centuries. We're going to focus on how the Cold War context really made a lot of Latin American, especially realities, worse, right? After World War II, industrialization, urbanization, right? Catholics were really reflecting on the ways in which the church connected to the world. And that idea of social Catholicism, right, didn't go far enough, right? What was needed and what people in a place like Latin America were really yearning for was liberation, right? From poverty, from injustice, from military dictatorship, from the large-scale Cold War conflict that was happening at the time. And so we're going to look at the Cold War and liberation theology. The picture right here is of a man named Gustavo Gutierrez, who is the father of Latin American liberation theology. He wrote a book in 1971 called A Theology of Liberation. And I actually have it right here, A Theology of Liberation. Gustavo Gutierrez, this is the English translation. And he actually recently died this year, or in 2024. So this is an interesting kind of look at some of his impact on the Catholic Church and on thinking as well as others. All right, so today we're going to look at the emergence of liberation theologies. This is actually an interesting photo, right? So this guy right here is Eugenio Pacelli. Eugene Pacelli, right? He's Italian, and he was a cardinal of the Catholic Church, and he was the Secretary of State of the Vatican, meaning he was kind of like the guy in charge of foreign policy of the Vatican during the pontificate, or the time where pontificate is the like when you say the presidency, somebody's presidency. This was the Pope's pontificate, the pontificate of Pius XI, 1922 to 1939. And you can see here, if you look at this guy's helmet, right, you look at this kind of these boots, right, this is essentially Nazi Germany, right? And here Pacelli is coming out of a meeting with German dignitaries, one of them being Adolf Hitler. And Pacelli and Pius XI are concerned to think about ways in which the Catholic Church is going to relate to a country like Germany through negotiation, through signing treaties. And they try this, and they actually get a treaty with Hitler. But then for the course of the 1930s and 1940s, obviously into World War II, this all falls apart. Eugenio Pacelli becomes the next pope in 1939, Pius XII. And so the cover image on our course is of Pius XII in the midst of Allied bombing, right? Italy was on the side of the Axis powers, right? On the side of Germany. And so the Allies actually bombed Rome, and many churches were destroyed and all that kind of stuff. He goes out to this neighborhood and he's got his arms outstretched, right? And it kind of signifies the ways in which the Catholic Church in many ways felt kind of impotent to be able to connect with a world that was essentially on fire, right? And so as we talk about the emergence of liberation theology, not necessarily in Europe, but in Latin America, there's a sense in which the Catholic Church is trying to, through things like liberation theology, really meet the world where it's at, trying to see the poverty, see the downtrodden, see the plight of the poor, and actually say, no, the church is with you and has something to say, not necessarily this sort of, lifting up your hands, what can we do, as Pius XII was doing. And so one of the framing questions we'll think about is, how did the Catholic Church respond to Latin American realities? And one of those ways will be through liberation theology. This is actually a priest from Mexico named Alfredo Mendez Medina. And Alfredo Mendez Medina was actually very prominent in starting some of those Catholic workers groups, unions, in the 1920s in Mexico. And actually one of the first people that will work with him in the 1920s in Mexico will be Sofia del Valle, the woman who we highlighted last time. So the development of superpower rivalries between the United States and the Soviet Union after 1945 really made long-standing struggles even worse in Latin America, right? Social and political arrangements that had gone on in Latin America, as well as added a new dimension to the scope and reach of American intervention in Latin America. So the United States was reaching into Latin America before, had done that, but even so more now, after 1945. The Catholic Church faced new challenges that superseded the previous conflicts between church and state. In the 1940s and early 1950s, Catholic leaders recognized the threat of socialist and communist movements. But the successful Cuban Revolution in 1959, right, you can see here Che Guevara, the famous Che Guevara, and Fidel right here, Fidel Castro, after the Cuban Revolution, marching there in Cuba. So after the successful Cuban Revolution, made the threat of sort of communism coming in Latin America even more of a fear of many people. The rapid radicalization of the Cuban movement from just an anti-imperialist insurgency to a communist state by the early 1960s reverberated around the Latin American region. So, but what factors helped shape a more progressive attitude among many within the Latin American church, which would eventually develop into liberation theology? That's one of the questions we're going to ask, right? So with the emergence of liberation theology, we have to look at several developments within the Catholic Church, especially in the first half of the 20th century and in the 1950s, preceding the Cuban Revolution, that positioned sectors within the church toward a more progressive direction. One of those will be Catholic Action, actually. The first was the shift within the Catholic Action movement. The Roman model of Catholic Action, meaning that all lay groups had to be, men and women and workers and young men, old men, right, separated by age and gender, with its most successful national establishments taking place in Spain and other places in Latin America after the Civil War in Spain, promoted a conservative orientation of the churches in Latin America. This came particularly through the avowedly non-party political nature of the movement, which had been especially welcomed by the episcopates in the region. An alternative model of Catholic Action came to the fore by the 1950s in Latin America, based on a Belgian conception of the movement developed by a man by the name of Cardinal Joseph Cardin, C-A-R-D-I-J-N. This promoted a specialized form of Catholic action focused on training students and workers. What differentiated groups such as the Young Catholic Students, or JEC, J-E-C, and the Young Catholic Workers, or JOC, J-O-C, from older established branches of Catholic action was their focus on confronting social and economic issues within national contexts. In other words, both groups promoted a keener knowledge of Latin American society, its problems, and potential solutions. Cardin forwarded a strategy known as See, Judge, Act. Through small groups, Catholic students and workers, often guided by socially committed Jesuit priests, educated themselves in the actual social problems of the country, in the countries in which they were in, and considered what steps could be taken within the actual context where students and workers were active, and then acted to produce change. So they saw the reality, right? They judged, okay, now I'm going to reflect on this. What needs to take place? And then third, I'm going to act. This was totally different than kind of the approach before, which was, oh, we're going to teach religious education, we're going to do catechism, we're going to do these kind of traditional things. But now it was like, no, I'm going to look at the reality. This is, let's say I'm in Mexico or Chile, and I'm like, oh, this is supposed to be a Catholic country, but I'm going to see the reality. I'm going to see the reality of poverty. And where would Christ be present? Well, Christ might be with the poor, helping the poor, or with workers, and I'm going to act after that in those different environments. So whereas the Roman model of Catholic action placed boundaries around certain kinds of action, often excluding political activism or labor unionization from the movements, the young Catholic workers or the young Catholic students allowed for social analysis to guide action, without preconceived notions of a separation between religious, political, or social activism. The second factor after this idea of this kind of specialized workers' Catholic action in positioning sectors of the Catholic Church in Latin America towards a more progressive stance was Christian democracy. In the Christian democratic movement in the 1930s and 1940s, especially in Chile, Catholic social activists in Catholic action began to seek an alternative to the more traditional conservative parties, one that was more robustly promoted the social doctrine of the church and was distanced from the church hierarchy. This was influenced by a man by the name of Jacques Maritain, and his ideas on getting closer to democracy, Catholic action youths such as Eduardo Frei and a man by the name of Manuel Garraton, and from Venezuela, Rafael Caldera, helped establish Christian democratic movements in the region. And so in the course of the 1950s, these became more secular in character, these groups, detached from the church direction, but with the stated desire to implement Christian social policies as an alternative to capitalism and also socialist economies. So it's a movement out of this kind of social Catholicism between liberalism on the one hand and socialism on the other, but now it's moving more political. Thirdly, in Brazil and Chile, especially socially progressive bishops came to leadership. So now the leadership of the Catholic Church is becoming more attuned to this idea of change, right? In Brazil, a man by the name of Dom Helder Câmara established the National Conference of Brazilian Bishops, or the CNBB, in 1952, which in essence bolstered his position as a leading figure among the more moderate colleagues, among his more moderate colleagues in the episcopate. In Chile, Manuel Larraín supported the Christian Democrats and increased ministries to the working class. These successes enabled both in their promotion of a region-wide Latin American Episcopal Conference, or CELAM. As CELAM was established, it held its first plenary meeting in Rio de Janeiro in 1955. This organizational framework provided a forum for new cooperation between Latin American bishops towards policies and development, meaning this was one of the first time that bishops from Brazil and Mexico and Argentina and Chile were all getting together to talk about the problems of Latin America as a whole. Added to the internal changes within Latin America, including JOC, right, the Young Catholic Workers, or the Christian Democratic parties and the progressive leadership in Ceylon, was a shift in papal leadership. Pope John XXIII, who was Pope from 1958 to 1963, called for a fresh wind to update the Church to the modern world, a call for a new council to take on these changes and encourage the developments in Latin America. John XXIII published Mater et Magistra in 1961, which called for social justice and an integration of the poor, and seconded this call in opening up the Second Vatican Council, or Vatican II, which met from 1962 to 1965. Then, in 1963, his encyclical Pacem in Terris, or Peace on Earth, urged the need for international cooperation instead of Cold War hostility. The 3 sessions of Vatican II saw the participation of many Latin American bishops to some degree, and both Larraín and Camera urged the cardinals and the now Pope Paul VI, right, because John XXIII had died, to focus on issues of poverty. Larraín told the Pope that, quote, every year more people die of hunger and disease in the Third World than perished in the 4 years of the Second World War, while Camera often repeated that, quote, social development is the number one problem of the council, right? So these bishops, Manuel Larraín from Chile and Dom Helder Camera from Brazil, were pushing the fact that we are here, we're Latin Americans, the church is here, the church has issues that the Catholic Church must deal with. 2 additional papal documents from the period, Gaudium et Spes and Popularum Progressio, would be applauded by Latin American bishops and theologians. In the latter, the Pope stated that people in the developing world, those in poverty, misery, and endemic disease, had the attention of the Church. Vatican II endeavored to rework the definition of the Church, moving it from identification with the hierarchy and towards the unity of all the faithful, the pilgrim people of God, whose mission was to journey alongside the world. Then, in 1968, in Medellin, Colombia, all those bishops in Latin America got together and essentially said, okay, this is what happened at the Vatican II Council in Rome. How do we apply that to Latin America? And at Medellin, they applied the findings of the council to a Latin American situation. It was a major victory for many of the progressive sector of the Latin American leadership. The official documents produced by the bishops at Medellin ensconced the position of the church as the people of God, not just the established hierarchy, and it helped forge a new pastoral strategy focused on critiquing the prevailing system of social exclusion and poverty, and expose the corporate nature of sin as reflected in social inequities, right? That this idea of the preferential option for the poor, right? Where should the church be working in the world? Well, we have an immediate need to work among the poor, and given all of the many needs that are going on, Christ is with the poor. Here you can see one of the lines from Gaudium et Spes. The injustice of certain situations cries out for God's attention. Lacking the bare necessities of life, whole nations are under the thumb of others. They cannot act on their own initiative. They cannot exercise personal responsibility. They cannot work toward a higher degree of cultural refinement or a greater participation in the social and public life. They are sorely tempted to redress these insults to their human nature by violent means. Right? This is the Vatican actually in this document saying that we get it. We get why people would want to rebel against this situation. So, these institutional and leadership changes influenced and gave life to grassroots change. In Brazil, under Dom Helder Câmara, so-called Base Ecclesial Communities, or CEBs, had grown during the 1950s and 1960s. These were essentially parish-based local meetings of Catholics to study Scripture, provide support for one another, and contextualize the gospel within their local communities. The base communities only expanded after Medellin, with official support from the clergy and many bishops. By 1978, there would be approximately 150,000 to 200,000 base ecclesial communities in Latin America. So, if we're talking about after Medellin, applying it to Latin America, what they do is say, we're going to regroup the grassroots parish, the churches, and it's going to be small community groups figuring out how to live out the gospel. And also think about and reflect on how the gospel might apply to my everyday life of poverty and exclusion, inequality, etc. Moreover, an intellectual critique of Catholic action had emerged as well. Former Catholic action leaders such as Gustavo Gutierrez, who you can see pictured here, in Peru, provided a framework for a movement away from developmentalism as a strategy to face Latin American poverty. After the Council, the Vatican II, and Medellin, their theological positions radicalized still further. And here was the thing that they would come into problems with. Because how did they try to figure out what was going on in Latin America? Well, they actually used analysis used by Marxists. Using Marxist social analysis as a basis for understanding dependency and the failure of the development, these priests called for liberation as a guiding theme to the pastoral strategy of the church. The movement represented a shift, detaching the church from relations with the state and taking the side of the poor, the dispossessed, and those who were oppressed by political systems that had excluded them from participation in society. The emerging liberationist perspective developed in dialogue with Protestant intellectuals and theologians in the region. In the mid-1950s, mainline Protestant missionaries in Latin America echoed much of the same dissatisfaction with developmentalist strategies, embodied in Latin American-led projects like John F. Kennedy's Alliance for Progress. Presbyterian missionary Richard Schall in Brazil, created an organization called Church and Society in Latin America, and he developed, quote-unquote, a theology of revolution, which sought to articulate a Christian strategy of rapid and radical social transformation. Although the theology did not necessarily endorse the use of violence, Schall, with the support of the World Council of Churches, based in Geneva, provided an institutional forum in which many young theologians, such as Gustavo Gutierrez, were able to develop their ideas. And so between 1965 and 1968, this group started by Schall became a location where Protestants and Catholic theologians such as Gutierrez, another Juan Luis II, and Luis Alberto de Sousa met, exchanged ideas, and pushed their critiques of dependency theory in new, more progressive directions. After the Medellin conference, Gutierrez and Rubem Alves, a Brazilian Protestant and seminary student at Princeton, were invited to a meeting in Switzerland. Gutierrez had been given the title of his paper by the organizing committee, The Meaning of Development. However, on the plane to Europe, Gutierrez changed the title of the presentation to Notes on a Theology of Liberation. At the conference, Alves and Gutierrez recognized that they were thinking similarly, that the question is not development, but how to break dependency and create conditions for radical social transformation. They presented jointly at the conference and thereafter participated in numerous subsequent meetings that brought together the leading theologians from the region. Within this context emerged a multitude of publications articulating an emerging theology of liberation. So, the development of a liberationist perspective encompassed a growing set of concerns about the place of the church in the world, the nature of salvation, history, and a new pastoral strategy. Essentially, Gutierrez and others reversed the traditional way of doing theology, arguing that praxis, living out the gospel in society, should be the true starting point of theology, instead of a traditional approach which privileged intellectual principles that only afterward were implemented. For them, the mission of the believer, and by implication the church, was to emulate Christ's identification with the poor and participate in the liberation of the human person from all personal and corporate obstacles. The praxis of liberation, then, led to a need to understand the social impediments to freedom, the structural sins, institutional violence, and social inequality which stunted the social and spiritual growth of individuals and communities. It was from this perspective that a Marxist critique of capitalism gained attractiveness for many liberationist theologians. The reality of class conflict and social strife seemed evident to many, and to deny this was to deny for them the experience of Latin America's poor. Thus, liberation theology provided a context in which dialogue with Marxism could be fruitful for both Christians and the political left. So I want to talk briefly about this man here, Oscar Romero, because in some ways, if we're dealing with things like theology and writing and revolution with Gustavo Gutierrez and the emergence of liberation theology, with Oscar Romero, we're dealing with where the rubber meets the road, right? So Oscar Romero was the Archbishop in El Salvador. And in El Salvador at the time, there was quite a lot of conflict between the government at the time, which oftentimes claimed to be Christian and to be Catholic, and those that were rebelling against this kind of leadership because they were saying they were being repressed, right? And so Oscar Romero is elected Archbishop in a time of this tumult, this Cold War tumult. And Oscar Romero will say that, that without necessarily being political, right, he goes up in many speeches and he pleads for the military to show mercy and to stop the repression and stop the violence that they are doing against many people that are not leftists or not Marxists, or they're not revolutionaries. They're just simply protesting, right? And for this, Oscar Romero in 1979 will be assassinated while giving mass by a military death squad. And Oscar Romero then becomes a kind of martyr for the church in Latin America, the Catholic Church in Latin America, that seeks to protect the poor, that seeks to be on the side of the poor. And this sort of legacy will continue on throughout the Cold War. And it's only with a more conservative swing in the church with in the 1980s and 1990s that we see liberation theology begin to come under attack by the Catholic Church itself. But if we look from the standpoint of today, right, I said Gustavo Gutierrez died in 2024. Well, in the reality, many of the core ideas of liberation theology have actually been appropriated and metabolized into the Catholic Church. Look at, for instance, Pope Francis's statements on issues of poverty, of being with the poor, of the church's mission is for the poor, not necessarily for the wealthy and the well-off, right? All right, so that's all I have for you today.